Hello everyone, my name is Tisha Mendes, former debater of Ananda College. Today we are going to be discussing the motion for the fourth round of the tournament organized by the Senanayake College. That is, this house is a socially conscious up-and-coming lawyers would choose to follow a career as a prosecutor rather than that of a defense lawyer. Okay, there is an Infoslide, which I think will be in the description of the video below. Now, first let's talk about the two ways we're going to go about this. First, let's talk about the setup and I think the broad technical knowledge that I think both sides should have in their repertoire when it comes to debating this motion. Secondly, we're going to talk about the two parts in which I think the debate should progress in order for an interesting debate that is easy to judge, and I think to both sides would come out having learned something from the other side and from the debate as a whole. Awesome. Right. So let's talk about the technical knowledge and setup that I think both sides should be doing. Right. I think it's important to notice that crimes at their core are wrongdoings against society. With that in mind, you have to remember that prosecutors are at their core public defenders, that they act with the interests of the general public in mind and act to protect them from those who would commit wrongdoings against society. Secondly, you should be noted that defense counsels' first and foremost priority should be to serve the court of law for the application of justice. You can't say that popular media has made it so that you have to defend your client at all costs. And right, while that might be cynically true, I don't think it's beneficial for either side to say that it is to that core as cynical as it seems, right? Especially considering the characterization with which the actor of this motion has been given. That is someone who is just out of law school and is looking for a direction to live their life. I think bringing debate in such a cynical, in such a negative manner doesn't help either side in order to win the debate. Right. Two key parts that I think this debate should go upon. First are like the personal, somewhat materialistic benefits to the actor, to the individual himself, as a course of doing either one of either the proposition or the opposition, what they say would be in their best interest to do. Secondly, I think it goes back to why this legal justice system exists in the first place, right? In order to provide justice. And if that is true, which side actually is able to then do that better as a single person? Awesome. First off, we're going to be looking at what a single person is going to be getting out of siding with either the proposition or the opposition, right? I think that at its core, it goes back to the difference between private sector and public sector, which I presume that both sides do have some simple understanding of, right? That the stability and security of a government job is compensated by the fact it is somewhat harder to get into, as in they aren't going to be hiring every Tom and Harry and Jayanta to become part of the legal sector of a country, to be representing a government and representing all people, that there is a higher bar of entry to becoming a prosecutor, right? So if that is true, that the motion assumes that you are able to get to that point, so we'll leave that first bit aside. But importantly, it is important to note that the benefits of the private sector can be used by the opposition to outweigh it, for instance, right? Because if you're thinking about in terms of what is best for the person, you can construe it in a way to say that you are able to earn more money, that you will become more famous, that you can go down in history as one of the famous prosecutors, like a Thurgood Marshall or a RBG or a Clarence Darrow, for instance, very famous defense counsels, for instance, right? This once you are societal, that because you are already socially conscious, you are able then to use your freedom, to use the lack of stress upon you as a person by being your own person, to be able to do what you think is correct, and all the benefits that come across with that, right? So I think at its core, where the clash should be in this debate is that on the one hand, you should be talking about the personal benefits, the connections you might gain from being on one side or the other, that I think is important to weigh off not only what you can somewhat say that you can say that we have what the other side wants, but to a greater degree could be a line of argumentation done by both sides. The important thing to weigh then is that when it comes to a person, that if you are socially conscious, if you are new to the game, not only what will your long-term impacts be like, but how are you able to act in the shorter and medium terms. I think this is a very useful debate to understand not only how does a person's life progress, but how important time frames can be within debates. Because when you are talking about the life of a person, that this is genuinely life deciding, right? What happens in your life is chosen from this emotion. So I think that understanding time frames and understanding what does a person need and subsequently what can they use what they have to do is very important. Which leads us into the next question, right? How then, on either side, can you have justice? Can you give people what they need? On the first hand, you can talk about what do prosecutors do. Prosecutors often hold discretionary power, right? What does that mean? That means that you decide whether or not to press charges to a person, what charges to file, whether to offer a plea bargain, which is to say you offer them something in exchange for something else, or if they plead guilty, for instance, right? And I think in the vast majority of legal systems that you as a prosecutor are given that power. What does that mean, especially for a socially conscious person, right? So that means that you can avoid putting hard to press offenses, right? And you can secondly just avoid low-level crimes being treated in such a massive way, right? So something like a drug possession or a shoplifting, you have the discretionary power to provide less of a sentence, to provide a more just sentence, and stop from wasting time and money by going to court as a result. Therefore, that whatever happens, for instance, the proposition could argue that you are able to control, just by virtue of being a prosecutor, you are able to control the direction with which people spend their lives. I think the second thing that you can talk about then is like you can have a systemic impact and you can ensure accountability, right? Because like in many jurisdictions that there might be problems with that. So a wrongful conviction perhaps, or a miscarriage of justice, right? So in those instances, you serve as a check against that, right? Because you are there instead of someone else, and because you have such a power in a courtroom, that you have the ability to stop those sort of things from occurring much more as a prosecutor. Fourthly, that you can talk about like the communities that exist within these places, right? Which is another clash point. So because you are part of a prosecutor culture, that you are part of these systems, do you understand what these systems are like? And you are then able to use that to provide restorative justice, yeah? You can like forward more things about less harsh punishments on certain crimes, and you are able then to push like an entire trend by being part of that system. Note that these are things you have to prove. You have to provide analysis as to why those things are not only likely, but why those things are impactful, right? Because on both sides, the other side is going to come at you saying that what you're saying is either not likely, or B, even if it does happen, it doesn't mean much. I think both sides need to spend a lot of time talking about not just the meaning of certain things, but also why they can do these sort of things. To become a defense counsel, right, you talk about the freedom, that you are often the only protection that poorer, marginalized individuals have against things like state overreach, against things like wrongful prosecutions, for instance. That social conscience implies that you are with those who are vulnerable. With that said, it is often understood that you can talk more on the opposition of the direct like impact you have on a person's life, right? Like for a prosecutor, you might have a much larger workload because the government has to be part of each and every criminal case. But as a defense counsel, you can like talk with your client and you can have a direct impact on certain people's lives, and that there's inherent value with that, right? It's important to be with the little guy. It's important to support others when times are tough and when they are in a place that they might not understand, and you are in a position to provide them that understanding, right? Fourthly, I think it's important that, like, the freedom you have as a defense counsel means that you have the ability to pick and choose. And through that, because you are socially conscious, you are then able to, for instance, take those who are most vulnerable only. You can take those who you understand might be getting hurt by corporations or the government or whoever, right? Finally, I think you can talk about, like, again, going back to that thing I mentioned earlier, which is about, like, the historical legacy of what you are doing. And, like, people like Thurgood Marshall, people like Clarence Darrow, people like Abraham Lincoln, about how these great, great lawyers are able to create a name for yourself and become legends within society, right? With that said, I think in terms of clash, what you might have been able to notice is that both sides want certain things, right? Both sides want justice to be done. Both sides want the little guy to be safer. But the clash comes within how are you going to make that person safer. And that ties back into the first clash, right? So for instance, proposition could say that if you are in the private sector, if you are a defense counsel, that you might on paper have the ability to choose, but in reality you kind of have to take any client that comes across, either because you are working as part of a firm or because, like, things are likely to be tight and it's difficult to pick and choose people when you need to put food on the table, which you do have, which you are most likely to have when you are a government prosecutor. So I think in terms of analysis, it needs to come from both the understanding of why do people want to do things, but also what are the impacts of people doing things. I think that I've given the general directions in which the debate should go, which when I ask people, judges who are judging that round, that feels like a common theme, that either teams are being too cynical in their approach and only focusing on, like, the specific benefits of, like, what happens when you go to the job instead of actually analyzing the impacts of the job itself, which might be due to a lack of understanding of roles, but I don't think that's enough of a justification. I think that this is an important motion to understand about debating itself. I thank the Debaters Council for providing me this opportunity, and I hope you have a very nice day.